This is a pretty strange story about this place called the Odyssey, which was this really creepy nightclub in Hollywood from the late 1970s to the mid-1980s. The Odyssey re-entered the news back in late 2021 when audio from a phone call leaked online. The caller was a man named Richie Albertini, who was a part-time actor, organized crime figure, and bar manager in Los Angeles over the past 4 decades. Albertini was actually a manager for the Viper Room, the bar owned by Johnny Depp, which was one of the hottest nightclubs in Hollywood for much of the 1990s.
Nobody more important to the Viper Room than me. Yeah. I was the face of the Viper Room.
And he was even called to provide testimony during Depp's 2022 trial with Amber Heard. So the point is, this guy was very involved in Hollywood, and in 2021, Albertini called into California Child Protective Services and told some wild tales about the things he'd experienced in his 4 decades in Los Angeles. His call covered everything from the death of River Phoenix to his time spent going to clubs with the Arquette children to a whole bunch of other crazy tales. But the focus of his call was the child abuse and trafficking he witnessed as a teenager growing up in Hollywood in the 1980s, which he described as a horrifically prevalent problem back then. And he claimed one of the main hubs for this child abuse was a nightclub named the Odyssey.
In West Hollywood back then, there was a nightclub that all of us kids hung out at. It was a trafficking mecca. It was called the Odyssey.
If you look into the Odyssey, it's honestly incredible that this place actually existed. There was so much shady stuff going on with this place. So the Odyssey was a nightclub for teenagers in West Hollywood that was open until 5 a.m. You only had to be 14 to enter, but reports at the time say this age limit wasn't enforced at all. Basically, if you paid the cover, you could enter and party all night. The club also turned into a go-to place for the gay population, which meant that every single night was this strange mix of kids in junior high, the LGBTQ crowd, and even celebrities would frequent the nightclub. And drugs. Apparently massive amounts of drugs were everywhere.
Let me ask you this.
Yes.
When you were hanging out at this place,
Yes.
was there drugs involved?
All the time. Constantly.
Okay.
On his phone call, Albertini repeatedly describes the child trafficking that went on at the Odyssey.
There is a world of trafficking that came out of that place. I already put one in prison for life. Now, it's time to get some more.
And you really have to wonder about the Odyssey when it was described like this in advertisements. The best discotheque for gay 12-year-olds and those who like gay 12-year-olds. That's just plain creepy, but there's way more to the story than that. The man who owned the Odyssey was Eddie Nash, who was one of the most notorious gangsters in the history of California. Nash was rumored to be involved in every crime you can think of. Drugs, murders, gun running, and it's honestly incredible that someone like this owned an all-night nightclub for teenagers, but he did. Nash was most known for the Wonderland Murders, one of the most brutal crimes in the history of Los Angeles. After a group of people broke into Nash's home and robbed him at gunpoint, Nash suspected that members of the Wonderland gang were behind the robbery. A few days later, a group suspected to include Nash and his bodyguard broke into the Wonderland gang's hideout and beat 4 members of the gang to death with hammers and metal pipes. Officers described the Wonderland murder scene as the bloodiest, most brutal murder they'd ever seen. The Wonderland murders happened in 1981, which is right during the time that Nash owned the Odyssey. And the story of the Odyssey gets even stranger. On his phone call, Albertini claimed that the Odyssey was also partly owned by John Holmes, who was probably the most famous porn star of the 1980s. Now, there's no official record of John Holmes being part owner of the Odyssey, but Eddie Nash and John Holmes definitely knew each other. At the height of his porn career, Holmes became hopelessly addicted to freebasing cocaine, and Nash was his drug supplier. It was suspected that Holmes was paid by the Wonderland gang to help them gain access to Nash's mansion for the robbery. Holmes' handprint was actually found at the Wonderland murder scene, though he claimed he was forced to watch the murders and he didn't participate in them. During Eddie Nash's trial for the Wonderland murders, Holmes described Nash as the most evil man I've ever met, which is really the exact description you love to see for someone who owns an all-night nightclub for teenagers. Another claim that Albertini made on his phone call is that a third owner of the Odyssey was a man named Larry Benjamin, a supposedly rampant child abuser who Albertini claims was eventually murdered by a 14-year-old kid he was abusing. And Benjamin's murder isn't some rumor or theory. It actually happened, and there's a lot of weird stuff surrounding it. Benjamin, a 42-year-old man who was described as a, quote, regular at Odyssey, was found dead by his 16-year-old roommate on the early morning of January 8, 1984. A 14-year-old boy who Benjamin met at Odyssey and was a frequent guest at his condo was arrested for the murder. And this just seems creepy on so many levels. Seriously, have you ever heard of a 42-year-old man having a 16-year-old roommate? And this 42-year-old man is a regular at an all-night nightclub for teenagers. And by the way, what is this 42-year-old man doing hanging out at his condo at 4 a.m. with a 14-year-old kid he met at the nightclub? And if Albertini's allegations are correct, the most disgusting part about this is the way the media covered Benjamin's death at the time. The LA Times article that describes his murder claims he was a, quote, benefactor to the 14-year-old kid, and that Benjamin was helping his 14-year-old, quote, friend. Benjamin was even described in the article as a cult hero around the Odyssey. There's no mention in the article at all of just how absolutely creepy this whole situation seems to be. The Odyssey was not popular among locals. There were constant protests about the club from area residents, and they actually succeeded in temporarily closing it down a few times.
The popular nightclub at La Cienega and Beverly Boulevard has been a target for closure by neighbors and city officials for the past 9 years. They claim the young patrons fornicate and urinate outside the club and near their homes.
During one of these temporary closures, the Odyssey burnt to the ground.
Arson investigators are looking into a fire that broke out late today at the controversial Odyssey nightclub.
And the general belief is that it was burnt by Nash for the insurance money.
Arson investigators are on the scene. This is an incendiary fire. Witnesses say that flammable liquids were thrown into the structure.
Over the next few decades, Nash spent time in and out of prison for drugs and racketeering charges. Despite his obvious links to the Wonderland Murders and the Odyssey arson, he was never convicted of either crime. In 2014, Nash died at the age of 85, and most of the secrets about what really happened in the Odyssey went to the grave with him.